All right, let's begin, shall we? Welcome, everyone, to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Davis. Today is August 19th, 2018, and my name is Susan Steinbach. I will be serving as the moderator today for our special guest, Johanna Stek, who is with us today. We know her as Joan Stek and call her Joan. So Joan is a very remarkable person, and I would like to begin by giving a brief little introduction about her. Johanna was born in 1927, raised in Holland, and lived through the occupation of The Hague by the German army. She is almost 91 years old and wants us to be gentle with her speaking efforts today because she's speaking in a second language. I assured her we understand everything that she is communicating. She has trained as a physician in Holland. She immigrated to Canada in 1955 to join her husband Johannes, and a year later went with him into the United States as immigrants. She's practiced medicine, given birth to 3 children, a son who has a PhD in physics, and 2 daughters who are also physicians. Joan has 4 grandkids, and her husband Johannes was a retired engineer and lived with her in their residence at Glacier Circle Senior Community. Johannes passed away in 2010. Joan has been a member of this church since 1997, but active in it before that time. So please welcome Johanna Stek. So Joan has some slides for us today, and we'll be watching those intermittently as she tells us her story. Would you please begin, Joan, by telling us about your childhood in Holland?
Okay. Well, here I was born in 27, and so I was born in The Hague, and it was in that's a big city in Holland, and born in a very modest family, 2 loving parents and 1 older sister. 2 parents who never went to college at that time. In their time, it was really only for the very upper classes. My dad had a job in the government in the Department of the Colonies. And my mother stayed at home, and we lived in a typical big city street, you know, houses, row houses, all stuck together. And we always were in upstairs units, and we had no backyard. And me and my sister and all our little friends, we all played in the streets. And we didn't realize that we, didn't have all the amenities that other people had. We had no central heating, and a potbelly stove in the kitchen, in the living room, and cold water in our bedrooms. And maybe you can show how we stayed clean over there. No, that is a picture of the map of Holland, right there, tiny country. With our southern neighbors was Belgium, and then there was France. On the east there was Germany, and just across the North Sea was England. We're a tiny country, but quite a prosperous country, and I'm ashamed to say that that was in no small way because of our big colonies. We had, all of Indonesia was the Dutch East Indies, and we had also some in the West Indies, but it was a source of, well, for centuries, a source of employment for many graduates, and a source of riches from the oil and all the metals and the rubber and whatnot that came from our East Indies. But anyway, there we were in The Hague, which is is the seat of the government over there, and in these very kind of very modest homes. Like I said, no bathrooms, no bathtubs, no showers,
No
hot
showers.
water, and we stayed clean anyway. Yeah, that was the way you bathed. That was, but we had fun, and we like I say, played in the streets, and had always 2 weeks in the summer in the country. And but in the 30s, my parents, that was unusual for parents at the time, they built a house. There was an empty lot in a couple of blocks further up, where there were trees in the street, and it was near parks and everything. And we had finally this house. It was a triplex. It was a large apartment at the bottom, and then 2 big houses on each side. And then we finally had room for our grandparents. We had 2 grandparents living with us as long as I can remember, 1 from each side. And so they each had their living room and a bedroom, and my sister and I were way at the top over there, and the life was even better. The parks were nearby, and the seaside was nearby. We walked to our elementary school, we bicycled to our high school, and life was good. And of course I was a little kid at the time. It was in the 40s, I was 12, and I'm sure that the grown-ups knew that things were brewing, but we were greatly surprised on the 10th of May of 1940, when we woke up to a lot of noise and shooting and whatnot, and there from that upstairs balcony that looked out over the other houses, we saw all those German soldiers come down on their parachutes, and that was the beginning of 5 years of really awful time. That really has colored the rest of my life in a way. It left me with a lifelong abhorrence of violence and war, and a lasting puzzlement how it was possible that one country could cause all this misery all around him. It was amazing. I could fill the whole 20 minutes with stories of the war. At first it was amazement when the German soldiers, when they marched, they were always singing. That was the weirdest thing. There would be a sergeant who called out a number, and then they all started to sing marching songs. And most of them were kind of patriotic songs where they were going to conquer England, and other songs were about how they would never forget their sweethearts at home. Anyway, it wasn't just a military occupation. They infiltrated the whole civic structure. It was really amazing. All these little things at first started happening. One of the first things we had to do was hand in our radios. My dad had just bought a beautiful new radio, and he smashed it rather than handing it in. They didn't want any news from the outside. Of course, the press was easily managed by them, but radio news was just, and we all, most of us at least, hid a small radio somewhere under the floorboards and tried to get the news from England. Our government and the royal family fled before the invasion to England, and they were the source of most of the of the newscast that we and then the Germans tried to jam those radio things, you know.
Jam the signals.
And we had little gizmos to try and do away with the jams. But anyway, and then all these edicts and rules came about. It ranged from the ridiculous to the really sinister things. Like symphony orchestras couldn't play music by German composers. No more Mendelssohn. Wagner was the favorite. And at one time in high school we had to hand in our history books. And they came back with the pictures of the royal family torn out and all sorts of things blacked out. They wanted to change history, I guess, in our minds. And then one of the awful things that started very early, like they told all the universities to fire their Jewish faculty. And the university that I later attended was the first one to say, no way, you know. And what they did then, they closed the university and they arrested the chancellor and they put him in special prison camps. We called them hostage camps, where they had all kind of important people in the country imprisoned. And then if some act of sabotage happened, they would take a couple of these people from the camp and executed them. It was just absolutely awful. And then, of course, things happened to the Jewish people. You know, first they all had to register, and I always afterwards wondered why everybody did that. But anyway, they were all registered. All had to wear their star, you know, and then all kind of petty things. They had to wear it everywhere in public, you know, all kind of just crazy little things. They at first, anybody with a star couldn't go to the movies, and then you couldn't go to the seaside, and then they couldn't walk on the sidewalk. It was just unbelievable. And then, of course, they all were taken away, and after the war, just about one in 10 survived. You know, some people hid, but it's unbelievable when you think back on it. And then,
so during that time, you were able to stay in school at the high school level. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Even though the universities were closed.
Yeah.
But it was an uneven and unsettling time to try to stay in school in the midst of all of this.
Sure. And our school was one of the buildings that had to be evacuated. We were fairly near to the seaside, and in later years they wanted a defensible space, so they threw out all the civilians, including us, and our school, and we had to find another place to live. And my father had some acquaintances that took us in with all our stuff, and that's when things really started to get bad. My dad died fairly soon after that of cancer. And my grandfather, who lived with us, also died. There was just my mother and my sister and one tiny little grandma who lived there. And that was, we were there when we had this last horrible winter, when most of Europe was already liberated. France and Belgium and the southern part of Holland was liberated. But we were stuck there. That was the winter of 44, 45. And that was a bad time with, you know, no food and all kind of... And at that time, for instance, they needed more people to work in the German defense industry, and they just rounded up people and took them away. Men, we were lucky. Well, we had no men in our family anymore. And then you noticed that there were some decent Germans too, you know. We lived in a big house. We could have had a house full of men, but they came to see if there were any men who were hiding. And I remember a little old soldier coming to the door, and my mother opening the door, and she said there were only women in the house. And he said, "Ach zo, nur Damen." And he just went, you know. He could have looked at the house and find all kind of people that weren't there.
The thing that strikes me when we look at the map of Holland is we see that very long border with Germany, and we see just how vulnerable and indefensible your country was at the mercy of this German occupation. I can't imagine some of the things that you and your family lived through at that time.
Right. Well, comparing to all the horrible things that are happening nowadays, you know, it was. But when it happens to you and your family, it makes more
It's
of an
tough.
impression. And then we had the bad luck that right before the end of the war, and I think it was in March of '45, we had the bad luck of being bombed. There were, outside of the city, there were several launching areas where the Germans sent off the V2 weapons to London, you know, these rockets. And the Allies were forever trying to bomb those areas. So we weren't worried about those raids because it wasn't meant for us. But one time, and we found out later, somebody made a mistake in the instructions for the bombers, and they bombed this densely populated part of the city, and including our house. It was the first time we ever went in the cellar. And because I was so scared, my brother said, "Okay, let's go." And my sister was still on the steps, and then the whole house came down. That was kind of one bad thing that happened to us.
No kidding. And your sister survived, correct?
Oh yeah,
Yes.
But the lady of the house didn't want to go, and she died. And then the last couple of months, my mother and I stayed with her brother, and they lived in an area quite near to the tulip fields. And tulips are very nutritious. We ate tulip bulbs. Yeah.
You ate the tulip bulbs.
Yeah, sure, but you had to boil them, and they didn't taste good, but they were nutritious.
They were nutritious,
Yeah.
and it got you through
Yeah.
that last winter of
Yeah.
'44.
And then we got this wonderful time, you know, in May of '45. Then Germany surrendered, and in came this Canadian army, all those healthy-looking young guys in their tanks and whatnot. It was really, really absolutely wonderful. And then came the time of reconstruction. Our own house was still standing, but it was interesting. During that last part of the war, the Germans were in need in Germany of all sorts of building materials to repair all the bombings that they had. And they looted all these empty houses. And when we came back to our house, we were lucky because at the front door were all the radiators of the central heating of the whole house. They had uncoupled them, and they were ready to take them, but they didn't get around to taking them. And the pavement of our little street was made of bricks, and they actually took the bricks out, and so we had a sandy street. We were lucky because the fire chief of the city moved back into the street, and he needed to go to his fire, so we were one of the first ones to get pavement again. It was interesting. We you know, cobbled together things because we lost all our stuff to furnish our house again, and then it was a kind of chaotic time to to get back to normal. And so it was in May that the war ended, and in September the university started again. And there I went. I had
let's hear about that time where you were able to re-enter the university.
Yeah.
And that was the University of Leiden, which had been founded in the 1500s, had been closed during the war and reopened again. So tell us about that time period.
Oh,
and what's going on in this picture?
Yeah, you know, we were part, and that was a very lucky thing for me. And towards the end of the war, they were starting, the university people were starting to think on how to deal with this big influx of students that would no doubt happen. And they, in the medical faculty, they organized underground courses. That was, and I was lucky enough to get into that, and we had all kind of first-year courses. In Europe, you go straight from high school to medical school. The pre-med is part of the medical school. So I even got little exams out of the way, and because of that connection, I was lucky enough to, there is a picture of, that was the kitchen on the balcony of the university hospital. And they had a special team of Red Cross people from the southern part of Holland. They were especially trained to deal with hunger patients, with real malnutrition patients. And because of this little group I was in, we could volunteer there, and we got army rations. It was just fantastic. I still remember the white bread with butter and sugar. That was something unbelievable.
Like manna from heaven.
And there I'm stirring the pot on the improvised kitchen over there.
You're stirring the pot, so that's you on the
I'm
right
sitting
side.
way in the back.
Way in the back, the second from the right, stirring the pot. The voluntary medical corps.
Yeah, that was nice. And then, you know, then there were 7 years of medical education. I kind of, at first had wanted to study biology, but I think kind of spurred on in my teenage youth by my father's illness and death. I went into medicine, and well, all the ups and downs of student life. And at that time was my first effort to be connected to a church. I didn't mention that at all. My parents were both lapsed Dutch Reformed, and we were a completely secular family. Religion and God was never discussed with us. There still was, the northern part of Holland was traditionally very Calvinistic, and the whole society was still, had kind of a veil of Calvinism over it, you know. Everything very sober. The churches there were all without decoration, no stained glass windows, no statuary at all. And the whole thing was, you know, you had to be hardworking and not be terribly happy. You know, that was almost.
Don't be exuberant.
No exuberance there. That was almost sinful in a way. You know, not so much in my family, but that was the whole. The northern part of Holland was like that. The southern part was Catholic, and it was much more joyful and fun. Yeah. Okay.
I think we're moving to the time period then when you met your husband. Is that correct?
Right. Well, that's a little bit further, but I just want to mention that while I was in college, I got in with a group of students who were part of a liberal Protestant church. And in our childhood, my father took us to children's church, it was called. It was also by a liberal Protestant congregation who had little services just for children. And that's where we were told about a nice God who wanted you to be good and nice to your fellow children and whatnot. Sang
the
little
early
songs
Bible
and that
stories.
was, yeah,
Yes.
right.
Yes.
And the only more or less organized religious education was really crazy. It was in public school, public elementary school. There was a little old lady came once a week and she taught us Old Testament Bible stories.
So that's where you got your biblical training and background.
It was just, but that episode or that time in the connection with the Protestant church, it never stuck with me. You know, so I really, religion was not a part of my younger life.
Okay.
And after graduation from med school in '52, I went in an internal medicine residency in Rotterdam. And of course, all along there were all kind of personal things, you know, relationships that didn't work out or did. And then I had a good fortune to meet my husband. And that was in '55. And he was Dutch, and he was an engineer, and he already was working in Canada. And he came back every now and then to visit his ailing mother. And then one time he came and he stayed a bachelor over there. He was 12 years older than I was. And one time he came back to Holland and he really wanted to look for a wife. And I was really happy to find a husband. It was almost an arranged marriage. Mutual friends got us together, and he was just on vacation in Holland. First he went skiing in Switzerland, and then he was in Holland, and we got together, and we really hit it off well. And we thought it would work.
Then he went back to Canada.
He went back, yeah.
And you told me about a story called Being Married by the Glove.
Yeah, oh, that's a weird story. But, yeah, you know, of course, there was immigration to deal with. And my husband had already in Canada, he had talked to a Unitarian minister, I found out later, because you had to, in the papers, that you, for immigration, you had to have a minister who was willing to marry you. But anyway, my mother was so overwhelmed by this whirlwind deal of getting married. She wanted it signed and sealed.
Whirlwind courtship.
Yeah, she wanted it signed and sealed before I left. And in Holland at that time, you could marry by proxy. And that is really an odd thing, but it was from colonial times when all the big companies in Indonesia hired recent graduates, and it was a long story, but you know, by boat around the Cape of Good Hope, and they only hired unmarried young men. And then after a year of work, they could get their fiancés over. But it was too much of a time-consuming business to get them back to Holland, and so they could marry by proxy. And that worked.
Shall we look at the photo?
What do we have? Oh God, here I am marrying in the city hall with my husband's much older brother standing in for him. That was the weirdest thing. And they used to call that marriage met de handschoen, with the glove. And the bridegroom would send a glove to his trusted stand-in, and they would wear that glove on the right hand, I guess, and then they got married. And we didn't have the glove, but we did do this by proxy. And then you have the reception and a dinner, and my husband, and my husband said, I don't know if it really was true, but he got married when he was in the shower, because because it was, you know, the time difference. Yeah. Okay. But it did make the immigration business much easier. So we married in June, and oh, there we are when we were young. Oh, and John was a handsome, nice man, but a very typical engineer. He went to Sunday school as a kid, and the rest of his life he did not want to have anything to do with organized religion. I'm very sorry about that. But so I arrived there in Toronto, and it was not at all the typical immigrant story, because he had a circle of friends, and in Canada they were very welcoming to immigrants. They actually needed people, and they encouraged immigrants from, oh, can you put that away? Okay. Okay. They welcomed people, especially Northern European people, and they had some restrictions, I'm afraid, to colored people. But anyway, they were very welcoming, and they always said, when you met new people, they always said, welcome to a new Canadian. It was a wonderful time. I came out of that little crowded country with a bad climate, and here I came to Canada with the wide open spaces, and we went camping by canoe, and we went skiing, and it was just wonderful.
That was the year of 1955 to 56 when you were in Canada together.
Right.
Yeah, so you eventually did join him there.
Yeah, sure.
You left the glove and the brother behind.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and my family. And then my husband's company didn't do well, and so he saw it coming, and he found a job in New Jersey, in the States.
Yes, moving, and he was working for the Curtis Wright Company, right, in New Jersey, and you got pregnant with your first child.
Yeah, I had 2 children over there. By the way, that company was called Curtis Wright, and I only, after many years, only realized that was the company that was started by the Wright brothers. It was Curtis Wright, anyway. But it was the company that was the easiest for immigration. We never had a problem there. We just got our green card, and it was no problem.
And from there you went to Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And he worked for General Electric. You worked on getting your medical license.
Right.
Right? 6 years of what you call tough work.
It was not 6 years.
As a foreign medical professional.
Yeah, an FMG.
Foreign medical professional.
You had to do all sorts of exams, and a year of internship. And in Salem, Massachusetts, it was all very educational for me to get to know, population and everything.
Life in America and functioning in English.
America, right.
Yes.
And my mother came over for a year to help with the family, because he just couldn't combine that with an internship. And then I passed my last exams, and then a couple of months later, we moved to California, and I had to do it all over again.
All over again.
No fun.
You landed in Folsom, California in 1963. So tell us about that time period.
Well, at that time I had 2 kids, one in kindergarten, one in 1st grade, I think. And then we tried once more, because my husband had always wanted a son. And so I had another child while I was doing all these exams, and we had a nice time over there. My husband worked for Aerojet, and it wasn't the best of companies, but it was nice. And we explored California, but always wanted to be there. My husband was a big skier, and we went to the mountains, and we camped, and we had a nice time. I was involved with Campfire Girls. And then as soon as I got my license over there, I started working a little bit, first for the health department in Sacramento and Placer County. Sacramento was an education too. I worked in Del Paso Heights. I got my view of how things worked with other colored people, and then I got involved with student health here in Davis, and first worked a little bit for them. They were anxious to have women physicians, so I was lucky, and I never had to apply for a job. I always rolled into it. So
you were the best thing they ever saw walking in the door.
Yeah, we were,
because they needed physicians to do the exams of incoming freshmen.
Oh yeah, at that time all the new students got a physical. It was interesting. It was 1 week. All these students went through, and that was interesting. But because one doctor would look at the throat, and another one would look at the ears, and I was involved with just a regular physical, and for several years shared a room with Dr. Storer. I wonder if anybody remembers Dr. Storer. Ruth, I think, was her first name.
Storer Hall on campus.
Yeah,
Ruth
and the
Storer Garden.
Yeah,
yes.
She was the garden person. She had a beautiful garden on the oak. And she had the most interesting stories about her education, because she was one of the first women doctors. She was terrific. But anyway, we had a very nice outfit there. We had a hospital, 40-bed hospital, and we had all the specialties. It was a very nice job, and little by little I started working more, and then when my husband retired, we moved to Davis. Oh, and I forgot about how I got into Unitarianism.
Yes, let's back up a little bit and get that segment. That was still when you were in the Folsom area.
Yeah.
And you were talking about the connection with the North Area Unitarian Fellowship from Orangevale and Fair Oaks. Tell us about that.
That was the typical thing when my kids, all their friends went to Sunday school, and I started looking for a place that I could agree with. And I think I found them through an ad in the local paper. It was a very nice Unitarian fellowship. I had never heard of Unitarianism, but I really found my home there. It was a small outfit, so you right away were part of the whole group. And at that time, my husband, he was lucky. He got into a PhD program at the just recently established College of Engineering in Davis. They went out and recruited graduate students and made it possible for them to go for a PhD and still keep their job. So that was a major undertaking for my husband, and several of the people at his work signed up for it, but he was one of the few ones that persisted, because he would never give up on anything. So
and that was in 1979, then, when he came to Davis as that visiting scholar on the fellowship.
Yeah,
correct.
When he had that PhD, that helped him to get a little job after he retired from Aerojet, and we moved here, and he had a teaching position.
Okay.
They called it a visiting scholar, but it was just an instructor, really.
Okay.
And he did that. I always thought that they didn't realize how old he was. He did it until he was 79. They signed him up for a year or more years, but it was wonderful.
So when you were at the North Area Unitarian Fellowship, you mentioned that it was a small group, and so you were very quickly involved in the activities.
Right.
In fact, going on their board and serving in religious education instruction.
Right. With a friend we did the younger part of the RE, and of course I was perfectly new to it, but you had beautiful guidance from Boston. They sent all
from Beacon Hill.
Yeah, that was.
And then when you came to Davis, You told me a story about your kids started attending their classmates' churches and learned that they were going to hell.
No, that was still in Folsom
It's
before.
still in Folsom, but that
was
was a motivation for you to get involved in
Oh,
your
sure.
children's religious education.
Sure.
When
That's
kind of to rewrite that ship.
right, right.
And so tell us what happened when you came to Davis. I see someone in the audience who was an essential person in your life here, and that's Charlene Kunitz.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Tell us about that.
At first, my husband just absolutely refused to be involved with the church. So finally, I thought I'd do it on my own. And so I came here, and it was at the time of Jay Atkinson. And my first entry to the church was the choir with Charlene. And I took 2 courses of you in the art center. Remember?
Finding your singing voice.
Finding your voice.
Do you remember that, Charlene?
Yeah.
Charlene Kunitz.
After that, you said I could possibly join the choir. We practiced at your house, and we only sang every 4 or 5 weeks or something, and but it was really quite in preparation. We made it almost professional.
I was in the church at that time too, and there's another key player in the audience, and that's Liz Young over here, who was the accompanist for the choir at that time.
Right.
So Charlene Kunitz and Liz Young were very much the core of the music program.
Right. And then Jeanette Robertson was one of the choir members, and we became friends, and she got me into the caring committee.
Now that's the beginning of a long career for Joan as
In
the
the
caring committee member in this church.
We had a very nice committee and very involved. Jay always attended the meetings at Jeanette's house, and it was a good working committee.
So Jeanette Robertson and Kathy Tucker and Lori Irish were some of the early people at that time on the caring committee.
And of course, Peggy Northup.
Peggy Northup
was she was the chair, and she required that every new member of the committee take her course, the Ram Dass course. How can I help? That was the one. And
Ram Dass, how can I help?
Yeah, and we had an official, a professional counselor here as well. I forget her name, Janelle
Curlin.
Oh yeah,
was part of that spiritual counseling team. There was a spiritual counseling center that was being organized.
Yeah. We were a little bit more involved than we are now. And then of course a major thing was moving into Glacier Circle. First of all, you know, as you probably know, it was in preparation for 2 years really. And I really liked the idea, and we went to a couple of the meetings to plan for it all. But my husband said no, all those old people. He said, and he was older than all of them. yeah, really. Okay, but then you know they moved in January of '06, and. Then Ann Allard, remember Ann Allard? She died in August of that year. And by that time, my husband's health was not good anymore, and he had prostate cancer, and he started with dementia a little. So I could push it through, and then we went in her house. Yeah.
So 2006, you actually were able to move into Glacier Circle.
And he had still almost 4 years of a good life. He would have benefited so much of being part of the Unitarians, but you know, I couldn't do it. And he was a stubborn one. yeah.
But it was a good, long-lasting marriage and 3 beautiful children. Everything was fine, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
sure. Well, of course, nothing is ideal, but we were married. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, but that's true. We were married 55 years.
55 years.
Yeah, and our kids all were okay, you know.
Yeah.
I have two kids in Southern California, and one daughter. Both my girls went to Holland for their medical school, and the younger one had always wanted to do that. She went for 3 years working in Africa, in Zambia.
Wow.
And by that time, always in a Dutch outfit. And when she was through with that, she was so Dutch that she didn't come back to the States. She married a Dutchman and has now 2 grown children who also have an American passport. That's interesting. And my other one came back to Holland and to the States and had a very good career in OBGYN.
And that's the one in Los Angeles.
That's the one in Los
daughter in
Angeles.
Los Angeles. And your son is?
He's also in Los Angeles. He went to Berkeley and to MIT, and then he works for JPL, that is the Jet Propulsion Lab
in
that
Pasadena.
makes all these things that go up to Mars and whatnot.
Physics.
Yeah.
Jet Propulsion Lab.
Yeah.
Let's wrap this up for this section right here so we have time for questions with the audience. But there's a very important relationship you had with the larger community, and that was Tuesday morning community meals as a cook.
Oh yeah, yeah. Of course, you got in all these community things. I have 20 years in community meals. Every Tuesday morning we prepare, and I followed up on. Maybe you still know her, Winifred Madison.
Winifred Madison.
Her husband was one of the first chairs of the board in here.
Of our church,
Yeah.
yes, okay.
And then I got much involved with iHouse, with the International House. That was a very nice part of life too.
Excellent.
Right.
So you had said that Winifred Madison was about 20 years older than you when you started as a cook, and she had just completed 20 years of service, and you thought, how in the world could she have done that? Yeah. And Joan has now done the same thing.
Yeah,
let's give her our applause.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
We didn't show the last few pictures of the family.
There's John when he was older.
John, later in life, when he had that long career at UC Davis, correct?
Yeah.
And here's your family photo.
Oh, that was at John's. Oh, that was at the wedding of my son, there in the middle with his wife, and that was a day after the 80th birthday party for John, and they all came, and there's my sister on the left, and then my younger daughter is on the right, and she was just, I think, 6 weeks after the delivery of our first grandchild.
Oh, wow.
And then my other daughter is next to her. And then the bridal pair. That wedding was organized in 3 weeks. We had this only ever big party I had for John when he was 80, and the family was coming over, some from Holland. And then my son and his girlfriend, they thought, well, when everybody is here, why don't we get married? And her mother organized everything in 3 weeks.
That sounds very sober and hardworking.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, let's take questions now from the audience.
Okay.
Who would like to interact with Joan? Anyone? Yes, Liz.
Were you less unusual in being a female medical student
No.
in Holland? Was that still unusual for a woman to
No, it was not at all unusual. At that time, we had no screening process. Anybody could register for the medical part of the university if you had the proper high school stuff. But the way it worked, they made the first year that was basic sciences and everything. They made it very hard, and many people dropped out, and far more women than men. So no, there was hardly any problem with discrimination or anything. Occasionally a little bit, but it was nice.
Anyone else? Yes.
Would you talk about the threshold choir?
Oh, the threshold choir, yeah. I got involved with that in a few years ago, mainly because, you know, when John Youngerman was so sick and he was dying, and then the threshold choir from Napa and from Davis, Napa where his daughter was living, came to sing for him. And I was so impressed, they came twice. And that's when I started on them. It's a very nice choir. It's really amazing. It was started by a lady in the year 2000, and it has, you know, just from her singing at the bedside of some. She didn't know what else to do. Was sitting at the bedside of a dying friend, and she sang, and that's she was a professional musician anyway, and that grew into a choir, and the other Joan knows all about that, and then it spread. Just in this less than 20 years, there are more than 100 choirs all over the country, and quite a few in England and in New Zealand and in Australia, and we all have the same songs. They are composed by threshold choir members, and there is a central website, and we all learn the same songs, and we sing with small groups of 3 or 4 at the bedside of people who are very sick. A threshold, at the threshold of life. And it's a very, very nice bunch of people, and it is a remarkably appreciated by people. We have these you know, soothing songs, and we have some more cheerful songs, depending on the patient. And we go to the nursing part of URC, and we also kind of perform a little for the memory units of URC and of Atria. And after our threshold songs, we always sing with, especially with Atria, we sing popular songs, and it's amazing how patients perk up and know all the words. You know, we sing from the "Take Me Down to the Ball Game," and I've been working on the railroad. It's nice. It's nice, and we practice once a week here in the Sanghouse room on Mondays.
On Monday nights,
on Monday
threshold
nights.
choir.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
With that, I think we will wrap, Joan, and give people an opportunity to question you one-on-one afterwards. But let's give our appreciation to Joan. Thank you very much.